Pleasure to be here. I didn't realize that Colorado is such a warm state. This is end of October, people. It's like summer out there. It's too gorgeous. So if it's like this all year round, I'm for moving to Colorado because I live in California now, and it sometimes dips below this temperature. But actually, I'm a Canadian by heart and citizenship. So this is exceptional weather for this far north for me, at least. I want to talk to you about open access. This is the end of Open Access Week. I want to be conscious of the pillars so I don't exclude anybody. This has been a great week for open access. We have reached a point with open access. So maybe I should do a little more introduction on it. Open access refers to the ability, when you are online, to find a piece of research that is of interest to you, a research article, a piece of scholarship, whether it's on literature, whether it's on a biomedical condition, whether it's on history, and that research or scholarship is free to access, that anyone can access it and click on it. There's no paywall. You don't need to be in a library. So open access refers to the creation of a virtual university library that anyone and everyone has access to. And what's so important about this year in terms of open access is we have crossed the 50% point. Half of the research and literature that is published this year, and certainly that was published last year, will be openly and freely available to everyone. And that's a huge gain. Okay, I know you're not applauding, but in my heart, I'm applauding. That took a large struggle to convince people. And you're not applauding because it's like so obvious. It's like so clear to you that this is, of course, the case. Now, when I say half the literature, the research, I mean that if you search for any research article in Google Scholar, any research topic, or you search in Google and research articles come up, you have a 50-50 chance. Because I say 50%, we're not at 51% yet. That's next year. We're at 50%. We just crossed that line. So what that means is that half of the articles that you find will be freely available and half of them will be locked up. And they will be freely available because perhaps they were published in an open access journal that makes everything freely available, right from the beginning. Some of the leading journals, the top journal in biology is a journal called PLOS, Public Library of Science. I'll try to explain all my acronyms today. PLOS, Public Library of Science, Biology, ranked #1. Anyone in the world can read it. There's no printed edition. It has achieved not only open access success, it has addressed the prestige question. It is the top ranked because it is the most highly cited, because its articles receive, on average, more citations by other research articles than any other journal in the field of biology. Because we often get a concern about open access not being prestigious, not having the reputation. PLOS Biology. Now, is this true in a lot of other fields? No. I want to be honest with you, but it's certainly true in biology. And it is true in the biomedical field, some of the other journals, but PLOS Medicine, PLOS is a very good publisher, and it's very highly ranked, but not #1, unfortunately. So that's one aspect to consider. But that's only one source of that 50% of free articles that in terms of the availability today. A second source is many faculty members and graduate students make one copy. That doesn't quite make sense. It's not that they have one copy they take out of the pile, but they make one version of their article freely available in a repository or on their website. CSU, Colorado State University, has a repository. It's called
Digital Collections of Colorado.
The Digital Collections of Colorado, which I made a point of learning before I came to speak to you today, so that I wouldn't have to be prompted on the side. Many faculty members, no, it's not many, unfortunately, some faculty members put a copy of their article in the repository, and the publishers permit it. publishers have agreed, the commercial publishers, the nonprofit publishers have agreed that faculty have a right to put their work online to share with others. Isn't that crazy that publishers would agree that a faculty member who raised the money, getting the grant, hired the graduate students, conducted the research, stayed up all night writing the article, sent it to the publisher, gave it to the publisher for free, and the publisher has said, yes, because you did that little bit for us, we'll let you put a final draft, not the published version, not the beautiful PDF that has no margins and is very hard to read, not that version, but the final draft that was peer-reviewed. Almost all of the publishers now permit it. Some ask for an embargo. I just ran into one this week where a student was asked to embargo their work, to keep it from the public, their final draft that the publisher has not touched, but has helped with peer review, 18 months. I'm deeply discouraged by embargoes of 18 months before that work can be freely shared. The National Institutes of Health, the federal agency that funds more research than any other agency in the world, and certainly the research in health is an important source, they permit publishers a 12-month embargo. And so one of the controversies we have coming up in terms of open access is an embargo of 12 to 18 months still open access. What if I have that disease and have to wait, my doctor has to wait 12 months in order to have access to that article? And I have to take 2 aspirin and hope that I feel better until that article is freely available. So there are all kinds of issues. While I want to celebrate the 50% point, I want to recognize that this is still a complicated area. The third area, the third way in which that 50% is made up from articles that are freely available is from illegal, from rogue copies. Some faculty members don't wait 12 to 18 months. Some faculty members don't care that it is the final draft. They put up the published version. And we're seeing a percentage of the literature that is being put up in defiance. I'm not recommending, where's the camera? I am not recommending that anyone engage in that kind of activity. It is wrong. However, some do, did we get that? Some do continue to do that. We even have this strange bird called Sci-Hub that in the last couple of years has become a BitTorrent kind of site, a Napster of academic research. It has essentially captured 50 million articles, scraped them using illicitly gained passwords.
What was the name?
Sci-Hub. I'm sorry. You'll have to figure it out. I cannot reveal more than that. Sci-Hub is being charged by Elsevier in the New York courts. I have to tell you this part. And it's a graduate student, well, there's some controversy about this, but Alexander Elibakan from Kazakhstan put together this site on what she claims is the innocent grounds that she needed this work in Kazakhstan in order to complete her degree, which is on information security, by the way. And she created Sci-Hub. And the Elsevier is suing at $125,000 per article. And Elsevier has 12 million articles in Sci-Hub at least. I know, so it's all very so I only tell you this because she wrote a letter to the judge. She is in Moscow right now, not in Kazakhstan. I like to think of her as being snowed in Moscow. 2001? No. Get it? Edward? Okay. She's in Moscow right now at the Holdaway Hilton, and she's being sued by Elsevier in New York, and she wrote a letter to the judge. She didn't appear, and she said, "This isn't so controversial. A number of people are encouraging open access and think it's the right thing to do." She cited Timothy Gowers from Oxford and me. Now, I've never been cited in what looks like a $1 billion lawsuit before, and normally I enjoy being cited, but I got found this a little unnerving. So I want you to see that what Sci-Hub demonstrates is the system is broken. that she has been able to scrape 50 million articles, and those are being made freely available. She has shared the data. Who's using Sci-Hub, this illegal material? Everyone. Where? Everywhere. The download map shows 20 miles from Stanford University, people are downloading her articles. This is not the solution. Sci-Hub is not the solution. We don't let other people produce the research, publish the research, and then we scrape it and give it away for free. What we want to do is transform the system. I'd be happy to talk about how to transform the system, but I want to do something else. What I want to do today is to explain why. This is a question. That is, why in the world do we expect research and scholarship to be freely available to everyone? Where would we get this idea? It's not true of the beef raised in this state. It's not true of the cars produced in Michigan, and Tennessee, and everywhere else. It's not true of any other good. It's not even true, I don't want it to be true, of Bob Dylan's music, of Margaret Atwood's novels. I want them to be paid because it encourages other artists and it encourages them. But there's a difference between what they do, what Dylan and Atwood do, and what we do in this institution. And I want you to understand that that is not just a matter of the technology. We are not just about a Napster trick that we can do. And we're not just about Alexandra Elbakin's ability to scrape articles off the web and put them in a repository or a database in Moscow. It is about the nature of the work that we do. So I want to take the question of why we expect open access, and I want to put it in a historical context. I want to suggest to you two different things about intellectual property. Two things that I'm making a claim about in the book I was referred to earlier, the intellectual properties of learning. So my talk is about this notion. Everyone here, by virtue of being here, apart from the lunches perhaps, but let's set those aside, or no, continue, go ahead. Let's set those aside metaphorically for a moment, and let us say that each of us is here out of a concern for learning. And I mean learning in a broad sense. I've been a school teacher. I'm not anymore. I was a school teacher for 10 years. Every day was about learning, particularly about teaching kids to read. I'm a professor now, and I conduct research and scholarship, and I see that as learning. But when I think about my school teaching, I wanted those kids to grow up and to read something more that in my day was people and us, and now today is Facebook page updates. I wanted them to read what was most serious and was most wrong and was most, in a sense, they were able to analyze in terms of the nature and understanding of the world. I wanted my students to be able to have the best available research, and that's why I taught them how to read. And then I realized when I became a professor that that wasn't ever going to be possible unless we all did something about it. And now what I want to present to you is that the intellectual properties of learning are different. 2 points I want to make. One is that we are responsible as university people for the very concept of intellectual property. We invented, we created this concept that ideas could be a property, that the intangible good of me talking to you, of the ideas that I am sharing with you, have the nature of a property. They have certain rights associated with them in terms of property. They have a certain quality, a recognizable distinctiveness. Think about Colorado as a state of property. Think about the land claims. Think about the indigenous peoples of Colorado. Think about the nature of property as a central concept to this country and to this state. And then I want you to think about this intellectual property that's related to that. Because property isn't about the land, it is about the rights associated with the land. It is about the treatment of people around those rights. And the history of Colorado and the United States and Canada have been involved since their beginnings around those rights. And in British Columbia, where I came from before I came to Stanford, we're still negotiating with the First Nations peoples the nature of those property rights. Now, the university did two things. It created a concept of intellectual property, and then it created a distinct concept, a form of intellectual property that is different than other forms of intellectual property. That is, the forms created by Dillon, Atwood, by the glass blowers of Venice, which were one of the first groups to receive intellectual property protection for their craft, Apple, and Samsung. All of that intellectual property, got it? Dillon, Atwood, glass blowers, Apple, Samsung, are on one side, and on the other side, CSU, all of these state universities in Colorado, all of the universities in the world, all of the research institutes. So there's a strange paradox here. We gave them the notion of intellectual property. We gave the world the notion of intellectual property. I want to establish that. And then secondly, we created a distinct class of intellectual property, and that distinction has been almost entirely lost. We have some exceptions. We have fair use. Students can go into the library and photocopy an article, and they will not go to jail because of fair use, private study. Classes can photocopy articles? No, they actually can't because it interferes with the business model, and Kinko's got sued. And so we don't have that one. You all own your own intellectual property. The CSU does not own unless you've signed a work-for-hire contract. And so the United States courts recognize that students and faculty and staff have a special, in universities, not at Apple, not at Google. You work at Google, you do not have a right to your intellectual property. You sign a work-for-hire contract that says anything you think of. My favorite example is Stephen Jobs writing on a napkin at a bar. As soon as he made those notes, once he'd come back to Apple, once Apple had realized the mistake it had made, brought Jobs back, it belonged to Apple. So this notion of a distinct form of intellectual property, let me give you the sense of history. So I started with this idea that we need to understand why openness is so important. And what I want to present to you is a series of properties or rights associated with intellectual property, the intellectual properties of learning. This history encompasses the entire Christian West, Latin Christian West. It goes back to the monasteries that after the fall of Rome, and even before the fall of Rome, but certainly after the fall of Rome, in the 6th century, were the bastions of learning in the Christian West. And in the Christian West, the monasteries established a home for learning that was based on no private property. It was based on a sharing of ideas. It was based on every member of the monastery having access to the works that were available and contributing to the copying of the works that were available. But the monastery was a strange place for learning because learning in monasteries was considered to be a potential sin. The monasteries were actually anti-intellectual, but they gave birth to a form of learning that we're still engaging in. Why were they anti-intellectual? Because learning, now you may not recognize this, but some people are filled with pride over their learning. And pride is a sin. They were boastful about their learning. And boasting is a sin. They were given to original ideas in terms of their learning. And that original ideas is to stand on the very brink of blasphemy, of heresy, of assuming that you have somehow the power to interpret the Word of God, that you can criticize someone else's interpretation, or the very words themselves, that you might point out a contradiction within Scripture. So learning didn't have a natural place in the monastery, but because people had agreed in monasteries to share their work, and not just their work, but to share their work and share everything they owned, because the monasteries were devotional, were given to reading, divine forms of reading, 3-4 hours a day when there's lots of daylight, 2 to 3 hours in the upcoming season of dark. This idea that you could put people together with books, with shared property, and with time for reading and not get intellectual activity was St. Benedictine's big mistake. Because sure enough, people started to ask questions during that period of reading. And one of the first justifications for learning in the monasteries was the ability to help others to learn. That the Venerable Bede, a British monk, who never became an abbot, never assumed any role of authority in the monastery, took on the role of being the great teacher of the Middle Ages. Wrote books not out of pride, because remember pride? Not out of anything to do with him, about everything to do with everyone else. The brothers and the sisters, a great period, medieval monasteries are a great period of gender equity. Double monasteries, abbesses running monasteries of men, separately from women. So this idea that Bede found a way of justifying intellectual activity, of explaining and providing a commentary only insofar as it helped others to learn, became part of the ethos of Western learning. Now, how is it that they're constructing intellectual property? Think about it for a moment. Bede would work with the works of Jerome, St. Jerome. He translated the Bible into Latin. And Bede would work with this concept of Jerome and would give great credit to Jerome's translations, great credit to Jerome's commentaries. And so there was a system in which he took the actual translation of the Word of God, which could have been the end of the question, and he found it valuable to identify it with Jerome. That the credit of intellectual property, the ownership of intellectual property, has to do with understanding. The ability of saying these were the works of Jerome helped make those works comprehensible. It was consistent with Jerome's interpretations, with his translations, with his letters. And so we're beginning to create an intellectual property in the works of Jerome, by the way, 4th century, and Bede 9th century. So we've got 5 centuries difference there. But the idea that the intellectual property ownership of Jerome contributed to the understanding, and that his works were properties. And he had the right to be credited with those properties only insofar as it contributed to the learning of others. Are you gaining that sense? I'm going to keep coming back around it. So the authorship and the ownership was not about Bob Dylan getting rich. Jerome was so long dead. Now you have extended in America copyright to 70 years after the death of the author, but Jerome was like 4 centuries dead. And there was no copyright in this state. This is what's interesting about this. The Academy invented a notion of intellectual property centuries prior to the legal instantiation of that property, and that we think of that as 1710, the Statute of Anne. In the 18th century, the British were the first, and America in the 18th century as well, created the first intellectual property acts. But prior to that, we begin within the academy, within the field of learning, to work with this notion that ideas, when they're expressed, need to be attributed to people to make sense of them. Part of the confusion of the medieval period was the pseudo-Aristotle and the actual Aristotle. That people were bandying about these names of what Aristotle wrote in order to make sense of his corpus, of the body of his work. And this idea that Aristotle's work was an intellectual property gave it coherence and understanding, made it more teachable and analyzable, is a critical aspect of it. So when I want to talk about these properties, I talk about them in terms of 6 concepts. Now these aren't crucial, and these are my names for them, so I'm not going to, as it were, put them on the whiteboard. Oh, this isn't a whiteboard, sorry. I'm not going to give you a slide on them, but I want to talk about them. The first, I'll do them alphabetically. First I'll go through them once. So I've decided over the course of this history that access is crucial, and that the autonomy of this intellectual property is crucial. I've decided that the communality, that is the shared nature, the communality is crucial, and the credit, I've already explained about Aristotle, is crucial. And then finally, the sponsorship and the use. Let me go through these each. So access. What the monasteries were about was access. Even though they were a closed world, they shared their texts. The copying of the works circulated. Everyone in the monastery had equal access to the books, and they only had a book chest. They didn't have a lot of books, and that access was important. But the autonomy for learning was crucial. And the Pope, I was amazed by this, the Pope repeatedly granted to monasteries autonomy. And you know who was the big interferer, the big mocker, we would say in Yiddish, but that probably wouldn't be appropriate? Was the bishop. The local bishop was the political force in Catholic communities in Europe. And the Pope repeatedly granted the monasteries exemption from the bishop's authority. And that autonomy, in other words, they could conduct their activities without being inspected. They could produce beautiful books. They could create commentaries on Scripture without the interference. Now, this autonomy is the basis of academic freedom. That is, when Bede said, I am working on a commentary of Job, one of the great classics, because I want to explain it, I want to help others understand it. And the local bishop might have said, how dare you interpret the Word of God? But the local bishop had no authority over the monasteries. The autonomy of learning is crucial. The independence is where we get our value. As we stand apart, as the monastery stands apart from the world, it is able to bring value to the world. This is the Archimedean principle. How do you move the world? You don't stand on it. You step off the world, so the logward, and you get a very large lever. So this idea of autonomy, access and autonomy, you got those two? We're going on to the C's. First of the C's is communality. I've already talked about that in terms of the monastery. But the communality of our learning is in the library. When I passed the new library here on campus, what a beautiful walk I had this morning, thanks to Dan Draper. When I walked past the library, it was a round building with windows facing the campus on the big walk through there. And there was even a 24-hour cube for 24/7 for students to work in. That is the common center of learning of the campus. Every book in that library is equally available to every member of this academic community. Is that true? You don't have graduate stacks, undergraduate stacks. Do you have recall? My favorite, can an undergraduate recall a book that a professor is working on that's really important to the professor right now? Can that happen? Then you've got communality. You have the basic principle that we have equal access. Now, we pay a fortune to bring those books into the library, but once they're in the library, that equality of access is absolutely crucial to learning. That's always been the case from the monasteries, the medieval universities. At Oxford and Cambridge, they were called, the colleges had private libraries to the college. But each Cambridge and Oxford had public libraries that were open to the Holy University and others. And the Bodleian Library at Oxford, when Thomas Bodley gave the money to rebuild Oxford's library, he insisted that it be open to gentlemen. It's the 17th century, people. But to this day, anyone can go into the Bodleian Library, and although it costs £5, to get a permanent entry ticket, you can make an appeal to have that waived, so that it is free. So this idea of the library is, and the book deposit, every book that is published in the UK, every book that's published in the US goes to the Library of Congress. In the UK, it goes to Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, and a few other institutions. Because there needs to be, in order to support learning, a communal space where that learning is completely shared. The credit. I've done the credit with you. We're good on credit. Credit isn't about egos, isn't about money, it's about comprehension and understanding. We need to credit who wrote the work to understand. When people read my papers, the first thing they do is they look at the bibliography for their own name. What is that about? Hubris, people. That's a sin. And unfortunately, I'm not a Catholic, so I can't condemn them for that. But the second thing they do when they look at my bibliography is they understand who I am by who I cited. I give credit to other authors in order that Foucault and Willinsky are like this. And that citation process is critical to our work, but not critical just in the vanity sense, Foucault, Willinsky. It is critical in the sense of comprehension and understanding. It is what makes it an intellectual property. It's what sets me apart from Justin Bieber. Starts with I and ends with intellectual. Because I give credits to my sources. Bob Dylan started to do this a bit. Have you seen this? He's been talking about the origins of his song. It's fascinating. The Chimes of Freedom, which I thought was like so original, so powerful. He's told us about the tune, and it is exactly where he borrowed the tune from an old folk tale. Now that's how we work. The difference is I cite. I want the credit of Foucault, Aristotle, in my work, vain as I am, but it also helps you critique my misreading of Foucault, Aristotle. So many. Forgive me, please. Let me keep going. Last two. We have sponsorship and use. Are you keeping track of the six? Yes. Awesome. Sponsorship and use. Sponsorship, now, I'm at Colorado State University. This is a land-grant institution. It was one of the great acts of this country. We did not have it in Canada. The land-grant institutions. It was a recognition that the universities, Harvard, Ivies back in the East, this is the 19th century, by the way, because you have a Department of Education dedicated, School of Education dedicated to higher education, so this should be common knowledge to everybody. The land-grant universities was a magnificent recognition that the entire country should have access to learning, and that each state needed to make provision for learning, for what are called the useful arts, agriculture and mechanics, initially, but now the whole range of learning. The sponsorship was crucial. No monastery was established without a gift of land. They would take a clump of earth. They would cut the clump and they would bring it and put it on. I've never seen a picture of this. I just love the visual thought of it, though. They would take a clump of earth. The noble family would march into the church holding, I'm sure on silk or velvet, a clump of earth with a little mouse sticking its head up looking around. Where am I? And bring it to the altar and put it on the altar. And the priest would bless and say, this is a gift to God. You have created a piece of land that you have moved toward heaven. And that's where we will build the monastery, and we'll use that land to feed the nuns and monks and raise the crops. In fact, we'll have sheep, sheep, and we'll take the skins to make vellum to create the books, and wood to build the covers of the books. So this idea of sponsorship is absolutely crucial. The two, sponsorship and autonomy go together. You sponsor something, it makes it autonomous. Right? When the state gives money to this university, we can talk about whether it's enough, but it isn't, and how it's going down, and it's a discouraging aspect. There is still a level of academic freedom. It is not like giving money to the different services for the road paving. It's not like the asphalt allocations. It creates an autonomy that is always in question, truly so, but that autonomy and sponsorship. So we require this sponsorship in order to gain that autonomy. The monasteries were autonomous. Now, believe me, they did so well in Europe. They were corrupted by the finance, by the money they had, by the land they had. They were the largest landholder in Europe at one point for the High Middle Ages. All of those things creating a character here. The notion of the universities. Bodley sponsored the public library. Thomas Bodley sponsored the public library of the Oxford University. That sponsorship enabled a separation from the world, an independence from the world. And our gift back to that world is what I'm talking about. Our ability to take the intellectual property that we created. You understand now why it's a property? It has distinct characteristics. It has properties, footnotes, peer review, checking, and it's intellectual. No offense, Justin. It has it's concerned with the concepts of the mind, with the understanding, why we give credit, why the autonomy leads to the originality of the work. Sponsorship, part of the argument. Sponsorship, part of why intellectual properties of learning are distinct. Margaret Atwood received, great Canadian, Margaret Atwood, when I was in Teachers College, Margaret Atwood spoke when there were 9 people in the room, and she read her poetry. A marvelous experience. But I should talk about Alice Munro. Dylan and Munro. What am I doing? I'm missing this great analogy. Alice Munro won the Nobel Prize, not just for Canada, all right, for herself, for literature. Let me give you some background. Alice Munro wins the Nobel Prize last year for literature, and this year Bob Dylan for literature. So Dylan and Munro, Nobel Prize winners, are creating a form of intellectual property, no question about it. It is distinct. We understand it. In fact, Dylan's a perfect example. Alice made is we're still trying to understand Dylan as Dylan. Like, is he going to go? Will he accept? And this understanding is still an intellectual activity. This still gives coherence. But it is also an economic basis. He is independently wealthy. We're talking in learning, we need an institution. We need the protection of an institution. We need to be able to educate generations through an institutional framework, and this is part of our intellectual property regime. The final intellectual property I want to talk about is the property of use, the right of use. When I started this project, I wanted access to be number one, because I'm like the open access guy. I wanted the freedom to get to the work, to be the most important intellectual property of learning. But what I learned in doing this history is that access is necessary but not sufficient. Because what matters from that access is how the work is used, the right of use. And we have an absolute power of use that Bob Dylan did exercise on the Chimes of Freedom. He took a folk tune, he used it, and created a masterpiece, in my opinion. We have a similar kind of ethos. We need access only for use. We don't want to be amused. We don't want to be entertained by the works in the library. We want rights of use. And we have a kind of absolute sense of that. You are not a faculty member unless you provide work for others to use. You cannot tell your dean that I just did a brilliant piece of research, and the dean says, well, I can't wait to see it. And the professor says, I'm sorry, it's too brilliant. You wouldn't appreciate it. I'm not going to share it. Now, you laugh at that. Isaac Newton was totally like that. I don't want to waste my time on sharing my work with you. He did this. He only published one article in his life. I'm so far ahead of Isaac Newton. I've told my mother countless times, Isaac, your son John. My brother Bob, son John. Isaac Newton published one paper. He had so many questions in Philosophical Transactions, the first English language journal. This is in 1672. In 1672, he's convinced to publish an article on optics, on the refraction of light in the rainbow. You know this. You cut a slit in the. You don't have any windows here. You cut a slit in a blind, and you get a prism. Do you know this? Everyone's, of course, studied this. Obviously, yes. And do you know the distance and the formula that we used? No. Okay. He cuts a slit in the blind, and people start writing in as soon as he publishes this, and to say, could you explain in more detail how you did that? I've already sliced every blind in my house, and my family's really upset with me. It's not working. I'm not getting like a prism effect, what you're talking about. And he said he was tired of these questions. After 4 years, he refused to answer anymore. Isaac Newton did not want to share his knowledge. When he died, we found thousands of pages, Newton papers, many of them dealing with alchemy and all sorts of things. So this isn't, I can make a joke about it, but that was wrong. His failure to share his intellectual property diminished his claims. And he, in fact, had this very large debate with Leibniz over who invented calculus, who was the first to discover, I should say, the calculus. And all of these issues about sharing and accessibility revolve around the use. And what we do at this institution is we use intellectual property to create new learning. We use intellectual property to propagate, as it were, a new generation of educated citizens. And this use is a fundamental right. There is no learning produced that doesn't have that use right built into it. If Dylan never shared a song, Alice Munro never shared a short story with us, it would be a shame. But it would be their right. That's not the case. You cannot take NIH funding. You cannot work at CSU. You cannot engage in this practice without honoring that right of others to use and build on your work, to use and critique, to use and gain an understanding of that work. And so in all of these properties, access, I'm going to forget the two, autonomy, communality, and credit, sponsorship and use, there's an intricate weaving of rights that distinguish the university, the world of learning, and at the same time, there is a distinct class of intellectual property. On this side, Dylan, Monroe, Atwood, Bieber, Apple, Samsung, and on this side, all of the work that you and your students do, and that the librarians do here. And so this idea for me is the argument about open access. We are involved in open access for only one reason. It will increase the use of our work. It will increase the claim of our work as being useful. It will increase our claim on sponsorship and autonomy by virtue of that usefulness of our work. And insofar as we lock up our work, insofar as we say, well, we welcome visitors. Anyone in the state can visit the university library here, but you have to pay for parking. Or maybe not here.
Oh, you do? Oh, yeah. We work here. We pay for parking.
Say no more. At Stanford University, we allow the public to come into our library 7 times a year. Now, it's obvious, of course, why 7. I don't have a clue. It's a prime. So this idea of the university as already making its research available is something that has changed. In the age of print, fair enough. You don't have to take stack loads of journals onto the bus and hand them out. I don't think that's reasonable. But in today's age of the internet, in the age when we can make access readily available to the world, then we have an obligation. We cannot do it for free. What we can do, and I'll give you the simplest of answers in my final moments here. What we can do is we can shift the current economy. Subscriptions came from the academy, not from books, or not from journals originally, but from books. Books were quite expensive in the 17th century to be published, 16th and 17th century, especially academic books with pictures, with displays, with wood carvings. I mean, I'll ask Albert Durer to do a wood carving for you. It could run you up a few bucks. And so this idea that you would create books was done by subscription. They couldn't get the sponsorship. There was no single lord that would underwrite the cost of a book. And the printers wouldn't publish on spec in those days. Up front, man. Don't leave me with these things. And so the Royal Society held subscriptions. So every member of the Royal Society was a sponsor. They would do things like 5 guineas, 5 pounds, and you could have 1 illustration would be dedicated to you. 1 fish. It was a very famous book of fishes. where and each of the fishes are illustrated. Rainbow trout. Joseph Haydn, let's imagine, sponsored the engraving of this. So that sponsorship began as a distributed basis on subscriptions. We're done with that. We are so done with that. But we have a $10 billion legacy. The libraries right now are writing checks in total for $10 billion for all of the journal subscriptions in the world. That is in order to exclude anyone else from seeing that research. We have subscriptions in order to keep people from seeing this work, because if they saw the work, it would drop in value, and people would stop going to university if they had access to the free articles. Don't you think? No, nobody thinks that. If you did for 1 minute, it's okay, because I'm very compelling in the way I speak. But no, nobody thinks that. That was a facetious comment. End of my talk, I can get a little facetious. In fact, that $10 billion could sponsor the entire body of literature in open access. Same check. Let's imagine it, everybody. The libraries reach into the inkwell with their pen, their straight pen, no, sorry. The libraries reach into their Acrobat PDF, and they write on the screen with their finger. I'm getting really good at this. Are you getting good at this writing? I write my name with my finger now beautifully. I can do my signature at these places where you have to, yeah. You write it, and you write $10 billion, same check. Publishers, how much does it cost to publish all this research? Oh, wait, you don't need to tell me. I know how much it costs. I wrote a check last year. Let me just check for 1 second. Oh, it costs $10 billion to write, to pay for all this research to be published. I will give you, let me get a fresh page, I will give you a check for $10 billion. Only this time, what's the condition? What's the one condition I require?
Everyone can access it?
Yeah. I'm going to give you the same money, only this time, don't lock it up. And you can keep all the extra money you save from policing. You can keep all the extra money you save from not having to do the paywall adjustments, keep increasing the amount all the time. We'll give you libraries. I'm speaking on behalf of libraries. I can do that. I've been delegated. I'm deputized by the ARL and the ALA to do this. We'll give you the same check, although we're going to negotiate it next year. But this year we're going to give you the same check just to make it smooth. And we want to make it all open access. And my feeling, and we've done surveys of libraries, is that they would support this. The libraries do not need the exclusive. The universities do not need the exclusive. It's not going to stop students from coming if they can read all the journals at home. And then we can say that this, as a state institution, is serving the state that much better. Is serving every high school, every doctor's office, every veterinary clinic, serving all of those state institutions that much better by having written the same check they wrote last year, only this time saying we want open access. And that's my simple-minded, way too short notion. But let me just go over, recap this for you. Intellectual property, we created the concept of intellectual property. Property refers to rights and qualities of properties. Those rights and qualities are particular and distinct within the history, the 14, 15, 1600-year history of learning in the Christian West. Does this apply to other cultures? By all means it does, but this institution, CSU, is the product of learning in the Christian West. I'd love to talk to you about the Islamic influence on the formation of the universities, but that's another lecture. Let's just stay with this. And finally, we want to argue that open access is not a Napster trick of the internet. It is consistent with the mission. It is continuous with the operation. It is crucial to the contribution of CSU and other universities. And that's the message I want you to take home today. Thank you very much. So can I ask for favorable comments or supportive questions from the audience? Or otherwise, I'm good. Yes?
Is any part of the financial model the charging of people for access for the publishers? Is any part of the financial model for them to be charging?
No, they've got their 10 billion. They're done. So no, it doesn't. It works against the article processing charges that authors are being asked to pay these days. It says, no, that's not the right way to go. It's working against subscriptions, and it's saying to the publishers that in fact charging the public $40 for access to a single article is, no, we don't want that. We as CSU are operating on behalf of the state of Colorado to say that in fact we want to purchase open access for every citizen.
And the authors wouldn't have to pay.
No. The authors are paying in the sciences where they have large grants, and they're really not good discriminating customers. In other words, they don't care. They're writing $3,000 checks to publish in a journal, and they have no sense of the value. So I'm not in favor of that. I think the libraries can be trusted to make sure that they get value for that 10 billion. I also think the 10 billion is not going to go up. It's going to go down, because we're going to work out a better arrangement around that. But I'm happy to start at 10 billion. And it says to the libraries, this won't cost you any more. You wrote 10 billion last year. Now, it means every library in the world cooperating. I'm exaggerating the ease. There's a big distance between that $10 billion check and my starting point. But we have projects underway in anthropology. We're doing an analysis in the biomedical field. The Canadian journals are looking at this kind of model. Ghana, an interesting group in Ghana of societies and libraries that want to do this. And December we're going to Cape Town in South Africa to look at it. So yeah, so we're doing more practical. I presented the easy view. It's hard practical work. Yes?
So you said we're right now at about 50-50 open access.
Yes.
Where were we 10 years ago, and where do you think we'll be 10 years from now?
Okay. So I happen to have been here 10 years ago, so I have that advantage on you in terms of the university. So 10 years ago, it would be 2006. In 2006, we were underway. We were in the area of 5% maybe. Good examples of that is PLOS, Public Library of Science, 6 journals, open access completely in 2006. Biomed Central, 100 journals, open access completely. So we did have examples, but they were rare. We had the publishers hated us. Okay, the publishers said, you are going to kill academic publishing. Okay, is that what you want? All knowledge? You want to kill all knowledge? They said to us, literally, to our faces. And they now, today, are saying, we have open access journals, just give us $3,000 per article. We would love to. We're looking for new ways to do open access in in publicly beneficial ways. 10 years from now, I won't be giving this kind of speech, okay? Because 10 years from now, I am sure, I feel very confident that we will have open access is the norm. The US government, at every level, is supporting open access. All of the publishers are supporting open access. The Gates, the foundations, the private, all supporting open access. So we've got the mindset. We just have to get that 10 billion flip thing going, and that's going to take 9.5 years. Now that you've given me. Okay.
All right. Well, let's